Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be in the world. I am Patrick Miller, President and CEO of Ampyx Cyber. I'll be your moderator for today's discussion. The topic for today's webinar is Stop the Fire Drill, Risk-Informed Remediation for NERC CIP. A recording of the webinar will be provided afterward, and please feel free to send questions as we go, put them in the Q&A window. We'll try to monitor them throughout the event, and if we don't get them through the discussion itself, then we'll see how many we can get to at the end. We're going to talk about CIP 7 today, really drilling into what is probably the most talked about and certainly one of the most violated requirements, requirement 2, patch management. I'm thrilled to have an all-star cast of some of the actual drafters of this challenging requirement. We're going to talk about some history and some context and probably some stories from the trenches, as well as some strategies for success. So let's start with the introductions. And gentlemen, can I get you to tell us a little bit about yourselves? Phil, why don't you go first, and then we'll do Scott and Dave.
Sure. Philip Huff, Chief Technology Officer at Bastazo. Started in with NERC CIP with these guys back in 2008 with the Order 706, FERC Order 706 drafting team. And Patrick, I think you preceded us with your UA 1200, 1300, so you're trying to fix your mess.
Thank you so much for cleaning up the work we did.
Yeah, that's right. But yeah, we've spent about 6 years together drafting the NERC CIP standards.
Well, it's morning where I am, so I'll say good morning. My name is Scott Rosenberger. I'm a Senior Director for Generation Cybersecurity for Vistra. I've been at Vistra for 34 years. Obviously, I had a role in the drafting team, originally version 5, representing generation kind of in that process. We have a fleet of generation, nuclear, non-nuclear, about 41,000 megawatts.
Hey, and it's afternoon where I'm at, so good afternoon. My name is David Rubble. I'm the Chief Information Officer for Georgia System Operations. We're an electric cooperative in the state of Georgia that serves 38 distribution members. I was on the drafting team for 10 or 11 years, working on things from version 2 through version 5 and some other side projects here and there. So it's good to get to chat with these guys again and share a little bit of background about what goes on and how we deal with patch management.
Kind of getting the band back together. Yeah,
that's it.
I'm afraid so.
Yeah, we'll talk about that coming up soon. All right, so let's get some context. We're taking everyone back in time to the version 3 because version 4 got superseded. We'll just ignore version 4, the 3 to 5 transition window for the drafting teams. Easily the most transformational time for the CIP standards since they were created. And again, thank you for cleaning up the work that we did originally. Then tell us a little bit about your experience being part of this. It really was a monumental effort. And Scott, let's start with you, but Phil and Dave, don't be shy. Give us your account of this as well. But so tell us about this transformation window, like the version 3 to version 5 space, and kind of what that meant for you at the time. So again, Scott, let's start with you.
Yeah, certainly. So we had, in the original experience of you either were critical or you weren't. And we had a tremendous effort at the sites that were deemed critical to put all these compliance controls in place. And it was my perspective that a high level of compliance controls drives a lot of compliance activity and not a lot of cybersecurity activity. So when the standards were being revised to have everything to a certain level be included at some perspective, I had the opportunity to participate in that effort. And most of the folks that were engaged were from vertically integrated utilities that had large transmission organizations, and that was their big area of focus. We are a competitive utility, only have generation, wholesale and retail as well, but regulated wise. And so I think my perspective was I was bringing the perspective from a generator to that effort. And my perspective on that is that a generation facility is less critical than the substation that it connects to. There's more energy flowing through that substation than the generator is providing. So a big effort on my part was low impact should be low effort. And one of the reasons for that is I saw firsthand that when you have high compliance requirements, you don't do anything more than you toe the line to get to that, and then you don't do anything else. And I thought that missed the mark. One of the unique things in my role is I'm a cybersecurity focused person. So we have a compliance organization that dots the I's and crosses the T's, but I look at the generation fleet and think, what should we do to be protecting that fleet? Having low impact assets allows us to meet the obligations that are required and then do more than is required to address cybersecurity for the fleet. The actual drafting process was a really interesting process, and if you haven't had a chance to be involved with it, while it's unique in how it is conducted, I mean, there's protocols in the standard drafting team where you have a name tent, you've got to pop the name tent up to have a conversation, and you get in line, and you may have a topic that was covered 15 minutes ago, and they're moved off to a new topic, and you're having to bring people back to the point you wanted to make. It's a good process, though. I find that my own just God-given abilities to read through documentation and look for inconsistencies, like, hey, we're using the same word I think it has two different meanings, or we're saying the same thing with two different words, but I think we mean the same thing. And so with the drafting team, there was a lot of effort in understanding concepts, like what are we trying to say? Let's say it in a lot of words and then figure out what's the language that we need to use. And I think specifically our industry is challenging because there is so much diversity in how things are put together, and you're trying to come up with words that work for a large transmission control center and a device on a pole out in a power plant, and have words that can be used to be interpreted effectively and consistently across that environment.
I'll also add some of the drama behind developing 3 through 5.
There was drama?
I won't go into the internal team drama, but the affairs. I mean, we were developing that at the time that of Stuxnet. If y'all remember, Aurora was released on CNN around that time. Yeah, I mean, Mike Asante was CISO of NERC at the time, and I remember calls with just the amount of pressure on the industry was tremendous. And we have this like critical, non-critical standard, and it's different than healthcare, because with healthcare, everybody has electronic protected healthcare information. Yeah, we all have that, but the electric sector was, not only were a huge target, both from a cyber attack and regulatory perspective, you have this problem of you have these big asset that everybody's aware of. And what do you mean this power plant that's sitting out that everybody can see from miles around is not critical? That's a hard thing to convey to people, where like with electronic protected health information, healthcare is like, yeah, so that data is that's private data, it's critical. It's like, what is the electric industry doing? So a tremendous amount of fear, panic, and distrust between the industry and the regulators.
Yeah, and I mean, I just add some color maybe about kind of the process in general. I think Philip and Scott are spot on, but again, it's interesting to think about kind of the way it worked and how the words got on the page too, and that you had kind of a team, and the original kind of team that we had around starting with version 2 and 3 stuff, it was like 23 or 26 people, and so we all kind of came in wearing different hats and had different perspectives from around the industry. Scott mentioned he was in generation. I was primarily substation at the time, and so I think the team did a really good job to the best of their ability to kind of take off their company hat and put on their grid security hat and try to write the best they could for to protect the electric infrastructure in North America. But you also kind of bring with you your unique perspective about how you're doing that. And so there was a lot of vigorous debate going around, and it wasn't just the people around. So you'd have the team members kind of primarily around the table, and then you'd have a bunch of observers in the room and on the phone. And the team was really intentional about trying to make sure that everyone had an opportunity to speak their voice and be heard in the room, whether you were on the team or an observer. And it's not a perfect process, but I think they did a really good job trying to take in the input that they could. And you've probably heard the expression that a camel is a horse drawn by committee. And, to some extent, we have some of that in what we're living with. But there's, just an awful lot of stakeholders that you're trying to address through the process as well, whether it's industry or, the general public, as well as your auditors, the regulators, the federal government, all sorts of people sitting around the table trying to make sure that we get the best standard we can for our industry. And so it was, just an incredible process to be a part of, and lots of work going on in the rooms as well as at the hotels after the meetings and in between the meetings on lots of calls. And so it was a really dedicated group of folks that went into putting this together.
I have one other thing to add to that. One is, this was introducing new obligations for many, many more assets, and it's a very difficult thing to argue against doing good things. But the reality is, if you increase and ratchet up the effort around low impacts, you would be shifting your focus to addressing all of these low impacts and miss some of the, or have less time to spend on the things that were most critical. And then the last thing is that this process is a people process, right? While there are technical things that have to happen, it's done through people and building consensus, clear communication, good storytelling, the behind the scenes work of a lot of people. I don't like what that says. Well, great. What would you recommend instead? And that's where the work comes in, right? What words would be better? What context? What would you suggest that would be a better thing to do besides you don't like what we wrote?
Yeah, and I have to ask, did it pan out like you thought it would? And Dave, I'll start with you.
No, to some extent, yes, to some extent, no. I mean, I think, I feel proud that I do think if we look back kind of with the benefit of time, I think the needle has been moved in terms of securing the grid in North America. And so from that perspective, I think, that was ultimately the goal. And I think that was achieved. In terms of the detail, in terms of did the words get interpreted the way we think they were going to get interpreted all along? Maybe not necessarily the case, but overall, I think the high level objective was achieved. I think there was a lot of intent from the drafting team to try to create something kind of, as Scott mentioned, that wasn't just overly rigorous from a compliancy kind of check the box perspective, but that there was really sort of objective performance that was risk informed, that was that we tried to bake into there, this idea that you would kind of continually identify issues and improve your processes over time, and it wouldn't kind of just sit still. And I think there's an element of that there, but I'm not sure that we fully kind of met that goal in my mind either, that this kind of objective of continuous improvement and trying to, there was a lot of discussion at the time too of trying to move away from this idea of kind of zero defect standards, which is, if people remember way back in the day, there was a lot of that, and there still is to some extent today. And in compliance frameworks, it's hard to avoid that entirely. But I think there's a lot of work around that, and always improvements possible for sure. And I think that's why the work continues today. And the threat landscape changes and continues to escalate, and so the standards have to do that as well.
Yeah. I'll add, we started, our first meeting was at the NIST headquarters, and the intent of Order 706 was to just create 853 for the electric sector. That's all you have to do. And we quickly realized, I mean, it's a great standard and great language, but we don't get the luxury of insert something that's appropriate here. Like the organization shall determine what level of appropriateness.
Do something good.
Right, do something good in these brackets here, and it was not audited to monetary fines and penalties, and so it was a completely, the regulatory framework you're applying this in is a very, very different. We took a lot of language from 853, but it was definitely not the same context.
Yeah.
And I certainly think from where we were to where we ended up, it was a great first step. It was a big first step.
Yeah, agreed. It was a giant first step in comparison. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so I think the question that most people have, and Phil, I'm going to give this one to you. Why 35 days?
That's a great example of how language gets constructed, how the sausage gets made, and it explains the environment of distrust. Patrick, this is the urgent action 1200 and 1300 had specified patch as needed. You come up with a plan and follow that plan. And the amount of distrust between regulatory authority and industry and society in general was so low that, okay, we've got to confine that down to something very specific. And so 60-day, the idea was, okay, if we do monthly, then the industry is going to go with like the maximum. They're just going to play the game and make the 60 days, which sounds pretty ridiculous now. But then it was also there are monetary penalties. So if you're 1 day late on performing the assessment or applying the patch, you have to self-report non-compliance. That's a tremendous burden, like almost a career-killing decision in the early days for sure. And so 30 days would not work, because what if you're on a holiday? What if you have Christmas and it fell on that day? Then now you're in non-compliance, so you have to pay $1 million a day fine. It's not the reality, but that's the fear. And so Steve Noss, which I think he's at WEC now, right?
I think, yeah.
He,
It's been a while since WEC's roster. Yeah.
Right. He's somewhere out there. But great guy. He came up with, I remember the meeting we were talking, it was the most ridiculous discussion. You had 2 days of talking about the calendar time frame of what monthly means is absolute misery.
Yeah. Well, we had the same problem with the annual definition, calendar year versus. Yeah. And when you're counting the 35 days, does the 0 date, like day 0 or day 1 count? Because it can be 36 days or, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I can remember some funny discussions about having like a New Year's Eve compliance party, and you would knock out 2 years worth of requirements if you just did them over that transition from midnight into the new year. So, and then 15 months was born out of that nonsense,
But so it was Austin that came up with the 35 calendar days?
Steve Noss.
Steve Noss.
He's a lawyer. So he was like, okay, what about just 35 calendar days?
Yeah, and I can confirm, yes, he is at WEC. So
yeah. And we were so exhausted that I think everybody was agreed to it.
Let's get us to stop talking. Perfect.
Yeah. Okay.
I'll say at the time, I don't know that any of us really truly realized like that when we start adding the 35 days of the assess the patches and the 35 days of the implementation, like the level of rigor that it was going to take to track all those SLAs through every single patch, like just the amount of kind of time to demonstrate that. It's been really complex on the implementation side. And I don't, I think the idea is we were trying to create some flexibility for, those tools that you have that just sort of roll patches out monthly and try to make that just kind of work for you. And then the reality of it is you're down there on spreadsheets saying, that one was 33 days and this one's 32 days. And, trying to prove that you got them all in. And it's when it kind of translates into implementation, it's a whole new world. And we're all implementers at the same time that wrote it. And it's hard to see going into it, like when you're sitting around the room, putting the words on paper, exactly how it's going to flesh out too.
I think, Philip, you hit the nail on the head of the challenge. It has to be auditable, it has to be specific so that people can look and measure their performance against it. And so trying to come up with language that facilitates that. And while 35 might be arbitrary, it could be another number, but it had to be something that was reasonable that said that we were addressing this.
And speaking as a former auditor, thank you. Because when there's so much flexibility in the term and someone's on one end and the auditor's on the other, they have to argue that space in the middle. It's a lot more difficult, but when it's specific, it's far easier.
You're a very reasonable auditor, I will say.
Oh, well, thank you. I appreciate it. Some may have a different opinion, but yeah.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we were known for having one of the toughest programs. But so with you mentioned the flexibility. In there is the option for a mitigation plan, lowercase m, lowercase p, mitigation plan for the patching piece, which I found interesting that it was the same language used in the actual compliance methods of uppercase mitigation plan, which is submitted after a violation or a self-report or something like that. But for the CIP 7R2 mitigation plan for patching, that was intended to provide some flexibility. So why was that? Was that just to give people an option in the case they couldn't do it in 35 days? What was the logic behind that? Anyone go for it? Anyone that was there?
Well, I think it was trying to recognize the reality that patching industrial control systems isn't really like patching traditional IT systems. And, there's a lot of risk with applying a patch. You've got a system that's out there and it's working, and, you get a change from your vendor, and that stuff is to be, particularly in certain environments, and I think Scott made this point earlier, that we're trying to write one set of words that's going to work for every little widget in a generation plant, to everything in a substation, to your most complex energy management systems, and they all got 35 days to get your patches out. And so you run the real risk of increasing the risk to the bulk electric system by applying patches in certain cases. And so you've got to make sure that there's an opportunity for rigorous testing. And there's also, we're in an environment where you're dealing with layers of protection in between that, and applying the patch is one of those layers, and it's an important one, don't get me wrong, but it's not the only layer. And so but that mitigation plan opportunity was an opportunity to show that you're dealing with the security risk that was represented by the patch, or that the patch is trying to address, while also kind of providing alternatives when you might get in a situation where applying that patch breaks something, or something of that nature, where because there's a lot of things we considered when we're applying patches in this environment, where you really need to wait for vendor certification of those patches and things of that nature, or you may not be able to take them out of service until you have an outage. That's true in lots of environments. You may be dealing with a control center in the middle of hurricane season, and you've got storms bearing down on you, and it's day 34. Are you going to stop everything and patch? And there's got to be other opportunities. And so I think there's that kind of flexibility to kind of handle let the entities have some assessment of the risk that's involved, have some obligation to deal with the security risk itself, but understand that that's not the only risk that we're facing on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and when we wrote it, it had all sorts of identify, assess, correct. I don't know if I remember some of that language. That it was all this flexibility, and you as well, Patrick, in the 1300, like there was a ton of flexibility because everybody knew this was a big problem. And so a big problem back then, but not nearly the scale of the problem it is right now. I mean, we're dealing with maybe, I don't know, less than maybe like 3,000 vulnerabilities in the NVD a year. That's like a fifth or less of what it is today. So it was like kind of Microsoft was notifying us of CVEs, but not too many of the other vendors were. So okay, that's fine. But that exploded on us. All the technical guidance, all the flexibility that was added in there, it was just kind of surgically removed through the versions to say, to be where we're at now, where it's very rigid. And because of that, the mitigation plan is a terrifying prospect. That means you have to tell a story to the auditor instead of I patched. I have to explain why this is a mitigation and how this is addressing all of the vulnerabilities. That's been a big challenge, and I think because of that, it's kind of the mythical mitigation plan that nobody wants to file one.
Because that's a really in-depth analysis of what's going on with this asset, how is it vulnerable, and what is in place that is addressing those vulnerabilities. And it's not just I've got a firewall. I'd have to look and understand what is the real risk. Is it a specific port protocol? Is it some software that's installed in this asset? Some of the things that you might be able to, generally speaking, you've hardened this asset, so the things that are there are what's required for it to operate. And so you can't necessarily, remove things or disable things and still meet the intended, business function.
Okay, let's dig a little bit deeper into that. For the mitigation plan, I've seen some organizations will patch once a year. They basically just log everything, and then they have kind of like a checklist of mitigation strategies they're going to use, and there's kind of like some pro forma language that comes with this. I've seen some degrees of success with that. I've seen some lesser degrees of success with that. In your opinion, for the three of you, explain what mitigation actually means. Like, what does it actually mean to mitigate the vulnerability for which the patch would have been applied? And Phil, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think mitigation meant that you recognize the risk of the vulnerability, and we're taking steps to either monitor it or reduce the risk. I mean, in some cases, a lot of vulnerabilities carry no risk at all, and so the term mitigation is kind of a misnomer. But the intent was that that you're constantly looking at this and applying a risk-based mindset to when do I need to apply the patch, because there's risk of applying the patches as well. There's risk of making any changes to your industrial control system. So that was intended to give you the flexibility to say, okay, 35 days, I can't do it. And the intent is not to take down this control center because you have to meet this 35-day calendar day requirement. Put it on the mitigation plan, and then monitor the risk. If you're aware of what could be done to reduce the risk, do that. The big thing was to avoid saying, I have a firewall. We have this an electronic security perimeter, therefore I don't need to patch it, which was the kind of the prevailing thought at that time.
Okay, so that's is it okay? I'm just going to ask this. Just pretend I'm someone new to compliance. Is it okay to just say, well, the rest of the CIP standards are there, and therefore I'm protected?
No. Okay, no.
Okay.
And I think that is a very general statement that doesn't get into the specifics of what is the risk and how do the CIP standards then mitigate them. They might mitigate them, but I think without a detailed understanding of what's the vulnerability, is it a port that's exposed on that asset? Is it services that are running? Is it installed software? What is the actual risk? And mitigation would be something, segmentation, or closing a port, turning off a service. Those are things that mitigate the risk of that vulnerability. Sometimes that you can do them and sometimes you can't. But I think you would have to look at firewall rules. A firewall might be a mitigation, but it depends on how it's configured and what the vulnerability is. So if you SMB1 to the asset and it's vulnerable to SMB1 and you're allowing that traffic through your firewall, disabling that or changing to a higher version of SMB would potentially mitigate that risk. But that doesn't eliminate the internal risk potentially, right? So, as you bring a TCA in, and you do have processes around that, but that detailed analysis is how you get to, am I mitigating that risk?
I think there's an element of time here that we haven't really talked about as well as it relates to mitigation plans. I think there was some intent in there that, the mitigation plan gives you a couple of options. You can choose another way to mitigate the risk. Scott gave a couple of examples of, disabling SMB1 or blocking that protocol at a firewall or something of that nature. But the mitigation plan also gives you the opportunity to say, I'm still going to apply that patch, but I need another month for testing, or I need to wait for an outage or something like that. And you might rely on some compensating controls. Some of those might be requirements, other requirements from the CIP standards. They might depending on what the specific vulnerability is that you're trying to address, they might need to be something else that's not required by the CIP standards. But there's that kind of element of time that the mitigation plan was, I think, intended, at least in my opinion, to give you some flexibility on. And we had a lot of debates on, well, what can that just be unlimited? And I think we just, ultimately landed, sorry, Patrick, is that might be a conversation between the auditor and the entity about whether they were using that reasonably, and not just, inevitably like delaying putting on a patch forever by kind of writing themselves into compliance with mitigation plans. So I think that was an important aspect, at least in my mind, that it kind of dovetails back into our 35-day conversation, that there's some needed flexibility to that hard deadline that's in the standard.
And that's a really important thing, because sometimes the cure is worse than disease, and operations is what we're trying to prevent. And if our cure disrupts operations, then we just defeated the process. So trying to protect operations.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Create an outage to avoid an outage. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Well, that was one of the questions that is common with this one, is what does a good mitigation plan look like, and what can you use for mitigation plans? Because patching with 35 days is pretty onerous, as we've talked about. And the strategy to relieve some of that pressure is the mitigation plan. And it almost seems like the mitigation plan was created to be intentionally burdensome enough to where you'd opt for the 35 days if you could, versus have to go the mitigation plan route. I see, Dave, you're laughing, so maybe that may be the case. All right.
I don't know that I would say that it was intentionally burdensome.
Okay.
I think it might have ended up that way, but I don't think we intended anything to be really burdensome.
Okay.
But I think it does go back to, we're trying to balance lots of different stakeholders here, and one of those stakeholders is the regulator, and so they want to see, in my opinion, some level of rigor if you're not just applying the patch, and to be able to document that conversation that you had internally, so that when you have that conversation with your auditor, which might be 2 years later or 3 years later or 5 years later, that you can resurface that kind of risk decision that you made internally to apply that patch or not. And so some of that just ends up feeling burdensome as a kind of result of the reality and how that works. And I think that's a target for if you see something like that being drafted and you know a better way to do it. I think the drafting team was always all ears on that kind of stuff, because I think Scott made the point earlier, the intent was not to try to drive a lot of compliance burden out of this, but to get to the security objectives. But it is a compliance framework at the end of the day.
Yeah.
I think it also does get to how you think about implementing patches, right? Test systems or test environments, or start with one HMI and patch that, and then let that run overnight, and then patch the other ones afterwards. But you start to come up with processes that enable you to. It's not fun to test in production, but sometimes that's what you've got to do, because you don't have a backup control system.
Yeah, just make sure you do it Friday at 5. That's always the best time to test in production. Yeah. Yeah.
No Friday changes. That's my
Yeah.
pro tip.
Before a holiday.
Yeah. Friday at 5 before a holiday. Yeah. David, you did touch on a couple of things that I know I always look for as an auditor. Are how do they describe the controls from a mitigation standpoint? Did you put in something hopefully preventive, and if not, then something detective? So in some cases, just describing the controls that you put in.
Yeah, I think that's there's a lot of flexibility into what you put in there, and sometimes detective controls are all you can get. But certainly, to the extent that you can have preventative controls, and a lot of times there are ways to eliminate the risk or vulnerability that the patch is intended to address through other mechanisms, for the way that the device is configured or something like that. And so putting that level of detail in the mitigation plan certainly helps, I think, to kind of show your case that you've addressed the risk that the vulnerability represents to your environment.
Yeah. Okay, I'm going to shift gears a bit. Scott, you touched on this a little bit. I want to go a little further with it. The processes that you're using to do patch management, right? So give us a little bit from the asset owner perspective, both Scott and Dave and Philip, you've seen this as well. what's it like to do this process in a utility successfully? Like with the least amount of failures, how many people does it take, or what are you using for assistance? Yeah.
Well, at Vistra, it's definitely a team effort because we have multiple groups that participate in a power plant control system, right? So the cybersecurity team doesn't own the control system; that's owned by the plant teams. And so in most cases, it's the plant teams that are facilitating the evaluation of what are authorized patches and how do they get applied in the environment, where we would look at the cybersecurity tools and the patching of those systems, and then RTUs would be another team that would be involved in that effort. So it's definitely a team. Physical security, fourth team that's engaged in this effort. And that's really, in some respects, one of the challenges is that when you think about a generation control system, you have many people that need to be coordinated together in this activity. To ensure that you're compliant. That really is, the compliance team's obligation is to track all that, to make sure all the right things are being done, people understand the process. I mentioned previously the method by which you might apply. If you have a test system, that's a great thing, but most cases we don't have test systems. And so you're targeting a method of facilitation. We actually have other systems. For instance, in our medium area, we have firewalls that are in our low impact, and we can test these patches in the low environment, validate that because the same system, same operating system, to make sure that those don't have any impact, and then we install it in the medium environment.
Yeah, good strategy. David?
Yeah, I think there's certainly a lot of people involved in this one in particular. Scott touched on the goodness, it's not anyone's full-time job, but it probably touches on at least a dozen or more people in our organization, and we're a relatively small organization. And Scott touched on, you really need the subject matter experts for each of the device types that you're dealing with. You need your RTU expert, you need your protective relay expert, you need your energy management system expert to take a look at the stuff. You can kind of front end that to say, okay, I received a patch, does it say it has a vulnerability or not, right? You can kind of front end that assessment with your security team, but you've got to ultimately have those subject matter experts involved in that assessment. And then, the way the standard's written, and we've talked about the multiple 35 days, you end up really needing some tools in place. And unfortunately, the standard is, the 35 days is unlike any other standard out there. So there aren't the kind of ready-made tools for this. So that, there's some tools that are commercially available in the industry. We ended up customizing our ITSM tool to creating some custom business objects that would track per patch all of the 35-day windows, so that we could end up with good compliance evidence kind of after the process went through. So you end up sort of needing some custom tools. You need a lot of people involved. There's some third-party companies that can help with some of this too, and kind of help scrape some of that information, because even just checking for the patches is an onerous process. And don't get me started on some of the vendors who will backdate their release dates and all sorts of things that just create all sorts of fun times when you're trying to show your 35-day windows.
Bill, anything to add?
I'll add. I mean, it was transformative being an implementer. Wrote the standards, thought we had it relatively okay, and then come July 1st, 2016, we actually had to implement this stuff, and it brought people together in the organization that didn't want to be together, and constantly. And it was stressful. I mean, it was a lot of work. And again, when we wrote the standards, the number of vulnerabilities that were coming out it was a trickle. And in 2017, it was overwhelming. And then, I mean, since then, we're orders of magnitude in terms of your spreadsheet of vulnerabilities that you need to track. It's so 5 times as long as it was when we wrote the standard. So it was I mean, just believe me when I say that was not the intent. Is that this level of detail and compliance was required to protect the system. It's just a different world now in terms of software vulnerabilities and the way those are reported. We didn't know what an SBOM was at the time. We'd never heard of SolarWinds. So
yeah, Log4j. Yeah.
Log4j, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, that's good. That's good context. And Phil, I'm going to stay with you for the next one too. But what are some more, since we're going, from then to now, what are some more effective ways to manage the problem today that we didn't have 10 years ago versus the problem just getting worse? What are some better options now that we have?
Yeah, I mean, when you're 5 times the number of vulnerabilities that you're dealing with, just the manual processes I think that we had in place or that we have that we thought about are no longer feasible. I think today you have you look at some of the tools. DHS has the stakeholder specific vulnerability categorization, a static decision model they use to defer patches. That to me is a very effective way of identifying, okay, there's only a few that are immediate that really need to be hit. We didn't have that at the time. Also the vendors are much better. Certain vendors are much better at supplying the details necessary for workarounds and mitigation. So our mitigation plans were kind of, we'll try our best. It seems like this is an SMB vulnerability. We'll do something that like block that port or whatever. But now with you have more machine readable the cybersecurity advisory framework, CSAF, has machine readable workarounds that you can use and just kind of looking at what adversaries are targeting you. There's a lot more that you can do today to automatically assess the risk than what we had before. I mean, it was very much the spreadsheet was your primary tool.
Yeah. And Scott and Dave, has your process dramatically shifted to today's tool sets versus what it was, 10 years ago?
I don't. I would say no. I think we have used an outsourcer to a third party to evaluate patches that are available. We obviously have to maintain the list of installed software and what hardware you have to be able to facilitate that. And so they have done a lot of the heavy lifting. Now we have a very small footprint of medium impact. The vast majority of our fleet is low impact as well.
Yeah, I'll say I don't think ours has in parts for some of the stuff, and I think it's an artifact too of when you asked about did the standard end up like we intended it, and I think this is one of those cases where parts of the process are overly prescriptive in the requirement, and the net result is it makes it more difficult to adopt some of the new technologies as they come out, and it's hard to change the standards fast enough to kind of permit those new solutions as well. So it's one of those where it's hard to write an objective based requirement, but to the extent that these can be updated to do that, to take advantage of new techniques and make it better, faster, easier for all involved, would be good. So
one of the other aspects of this is, and I see this more often on our low impact side, but as you look for better ways of doing this, you really have to evaluate, are you introducing new risk to the environment based on this methodology that you're thinking about implementing? You start thinking about like account management. Could I manage accounts for my fleet for one big domain? Sure, I could, but that doesn't seem like a really good plan. I'm putting all of my eggs in one basket. Just attack that one thing. Automatic patching, could we do that? We could, but there's ramifications to that as well. And so I think that you're always having to evaluate the impact of an improvement that might make this better, but you might be just squeezing the balloon and introducing additional risks somewhere else that you have to evaluate.
Yeah, let alone adding those vulnerabilities in a cloud-based SaaS system.
Those just get managed by the cloud provider, right? It's just how it's just someone else, right? Sure. Okay. Now, let's see. So that begs the question, do you think this is ever going to get modified? Like, two things. Do you think it's going to get modified? If so, how? And then also, would you want to join the next drafting team to do it?
I guess I'll go
Okay,
out on a limb. I think it'll get modified at some point.
Okay.
There's been some drafting teams working on some substantial overhauls that sort of make the standards more flexible for cloud and other solutions that are out there. The other thing I think is NERC is started to take a hard look at the standards process just in general, and they've got a team looking at ways that they can make the standards development process more flexible, quicker to react. You know, a lot of that's kind of driven some out of the response to some of the winter storms on the operational side and the complexity of writing standards around those pieces. But I think NERC's done, you know, kudos to them to really be open to rethink the drafting process in general, and how it could be more efficient, how it could be better, you know, than 20 of us sitting around a table raising our tent cards over a week kind of thing. And so, yeah, I mean, assuming I had the time, I'd certainly throw my name in the hat to do some more. It was probably one of the most valuable teams I've ever worked on. You know, both from, you know, the relationships that I built across the industry with the guys that are on the call here, but also probably the best free training I've ever been in on, you know, how other people get things done. You know, all the, you know, just all the things. So for sure, it's I would definitely encourage anybody ever thinking about it to sign up.
It's a lot of work,
Okay,
but there's a lot of good that comes from it.
Yeah, and David, before you go, or before you close out that statement, how would you modify it?
I'd probably just bring up ChatGPT and ask it to rewrite the standard for me. I don't know.
Oh God, don't even introduce that. It's going to be the next thing. NERC's just going to say we're going to ChatGPT the whole standard.
Patrick,
Time.
I have a comment to that, and it may not relate to our medium impact. Generally speaking, no, not even general. We have data dials in place everywhere we have medium impact, right? It reduces the risk. It actually reduces the compliance obligation as well. When I think about what we're doing at our low impact fleets, we are absolutely looking at pathway analysis to understand the risk of the connectivity of assets, both inside and outside of our environments. You know, we have a highly segmented environment, and when I look at a vulnerability on a system and then look at its accessibility as well as the method of access and how that vulnerability is compromised, we are definitely targeting the work that we're doing to address the highest risk things. Additionally, with pathway analysis, and this kind of gets to that comment I made previously, we are looking at, if something happens at this site, what are the propagation methods across my fleet that exist, and how could those be a problem for me that I might need to remediate activities to be able to protect the fleet. You know, if someone were to bypass a transient cyber asset or removal media control, and something were to happen at that site, what keeps it from propagating across my environment? So we are doing that type of analysis, which is helping us to, instead of spreading it like peanut butter and trying to get everything all over the place, we're really trying to target the things that really make a difference, because my role is cybersecurity. So I want to put our effort into the things that matter.
Yeah. So, and kind of go back to your question, if you look at the current drafting team efforts, I mean, I think of Jake Cribb. Jake could be on this call, but he was instrumental in drafting CIP 7, so I'll throw him under the bus.
He's been instrumental on, I think, every drafting team since the
yeah, right. But yeah, and he's a Southern company. He tried with virtualization, and I think it's still at FERC. I mean, we're 2000. We're over 10 years. I mean, almost 15 years beyond like VMware hitting,
Yeah.
to where we have a good definition of virtualization, and so that standard still sits at FERC. I think it finally made it over the finish line, but we haven't even touched cloud computing, nothing with AI and cybersecurity. And I think the way drafting happens is different than where we were at. It was such a burdensome process. Most of us were spending over half of our working hours on the drafting team, which is that's a heavy burden for organizations to provide. And so I'm hopeful that a new, fresh group of leaders in the industry will see kind of, okay, why are we doing it this way still, and come up with an innovation in the way, you know, cybersecurity compliance and the regulation happens. Maybe it may not be the same thing that we did with NERC CIP, but there has to be something to make this more meaningful and make the compliance work more valuable for cybersecurity.
Okay, so you've all successfully dodged my question, so I'm going to ask it again. What would you actually change? What would be like a recommendation to modify? You've been there, you wrote it, you had to implement it. If you were to make it better for yourself, what would you change?
Yeah, I mean, I would say the way we had the flexibility that we had initially, and there has to be more trust in the process between regulator and entity, and NERC has learned that lesson. If you see all their standards that have been developed since, you don't have anything that looks like CIP. It's all very much risk based, and so that they understand that. But I would take out a lot of what was in 706 with those highly specific timelines, because that's where the cost of bookkeeping comes into play.
Yeah, I would probably try to reframe CIP 7R2 just in general around having an entity define a vulnerability management program for its assets, that took into account things like patches, but also other vulnerabilities that are released, and give some flexibility to be able to look at vulnerabilities in new ways as new technologies are introduced. But you could also kind of do the traditional check for your patches every month too. I mean, both things are important. I think it's just, how do you craft that in a way that's, both meaningful for the entity to do the work and also auditable? So the devil's in the details, but something along those lines is probably where I would be interested in seeing.
I think when you think about the all of the cybersecurity controls that are in place, that's kind of like a blanket of like, here's a bunch of things to go do and address, but each case is specific of how to do, like physical security controls. How did you apply physical security controls? Did you put it around the perimeter? Are you locking the cabinet that thing is in, port blockers in every port that's available around that? Because there may be ways to protect those assets from change and from access that don't require and address that vulnerability, that don't require you to apply a patch. But that specifics, how do you understand what good looks like there, would have to be understood.
Okay, so that begs the question, is the end game, is the security, I guess, security endeavor, the security objective, is it to manage vulnerabilities or is it to patch?
Yeah,
I think it's to manage vulnerabilities.
yeah.
But
I mean, you wrote it, so okay.
well, I don't know if you've ever been to a meeting where everybody left with a different opinion of what the thing was. So it certainly could be the case.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think patching was the easy answer, because it's a very clear
Measurable.
bookkeeping thing.
Yeah.
It's not the best answer, but it was the easiest at the time.
Okay.
Well, and if you think about every other security framework out there, they all address patching in some way. And so if we just didn't even mention it, I think that it'd been a clear gap. So you gotta address the elephant somehow.
All right. Well, I'm going to leave a little bit of time for questions here. It's been a phenomenal discussion. I really appreciate the walk down memory lane. First one is, how long was the drafting process? This is from anonymous attendee. For you guys, at least, how long was your drafting process?
My sentence was 6 years.
Yeah. This years, yeah.
I think I was on the team for 11, and that was we did version 2, 3, the version 4 that is never to be spoken of, version 5, and a few other things. So it depends, and I think that's a piece that NERC is actively trying to work on, trying to make that faster, so they get things quicker. But typical, I think, for a standard, probably 12 to 18 months at this point.
Yeah, it tells you something that Dave was in for 11 years and I got out if it's free with good behavior.
Quick hit.
That's too slow to move.
Scott was the origin of 1500 megawatts, by the way, and the segmentation within the plant. So,
okay.
We had one of the early technical conferences was near like a Bass Pro Shop or something, and they literally got us little targets to wear on our name tags. This is starting to feel the same to me.
Well, we may need to have an entirely separate discussion on the 1500 megawatt threshold, because I've heard lots of stories.
I wanted it higher.
I'm sure you did. Didn't that come into like adverse reliability impact and some other factors that came in play there? And
At the time, spinning reserve
spinning
was
reserve, that's
2,300
right.
megawatts in the smallest region of ERCOT.
Yeah.
We were built to survive that impact. We can handle 1,500. Generate trip off every day. It's just what happens.
Right.
Grid's designed to take it.
It is, yes. Dynamic contingencies. We used to have the TPL4 category D stuff, but all right. The next one from anonymous attendee is, how are you each assessing risk at your organizations while also hitting compliance requirements? That's a tough one. I mean, and trying to keep that short as well.
Kidding. So we are using cybersecurity framework, the SCF. We like the actual language of the SCF. There's nothing new under the sun, right? It's all the same kind of controls. It's how you group them and what you call them that identifies what's there. We actually are measuring what good looks like. That's a challenge with the cybersecurity framework. As Philip mentioned in the beginning, it says do good things. They have a process to identify to do this thing, and it doesn't tell you what that process should be. So we go through the process of identifying what does good look like for Vistra, and then we try to measure that.
And I'll say, I think similar thing on our side. We've also adopted the NIST cybersecurity framework in addition to implementing the NERC CIP requirements. And then I'll say one of the big things that's really helped us is just full 100% adoption of a rigorous internal controls program. So lots of effort into documenting our risk and corresponding controls, and then having those continuously reviewed by internal teams, compliance, internal audit, so that you're continuously assessing your program and trying to find ways to improve. That's been a tremendous help to us.
Awesome. It's a mature state. Yeah, Phil.
Yeah, no, I'm not in an org in this perspective, but I think there are a lot better approaches to identifying who the adversary is, what their capabilities are, what the vulnerability actually does, how it might be exploited. I mean, we didn't have the known exploitable vulnerability catalog. And then the impact, like understanding the impact with there are a lot more possibilities with AI to hone in on the specific risk to a specific asset, specific vulnerability that scales a lot better than what we've had in the past.
One thing I'd add to that is the concept of scope is like absolutely critical. Inventory, understanding your assets are you doing all the right things? Years ago, in responding to this survey on do you have antivirus? Well, yeah, except for where we don't. And that except for where we don't is my phrase around where my focus is. When we look at scope, we're doing good things except where we're not. And so where are those things that we're not, so that we can, even when you report on quality, right? If you report on, here's the status of antivirus, out of how many, like it's the status, what's my reporting scope? Am I reporting 100% on 20% or 100% on 100%? Because it makes a huge difference to whether you feel good about that number or not.
Awesome. All right, well, we're close to time. I'd like one last thing from each of you. Give us one single action, like a sentence, that attendees should do to make their patch management life easier. Like don't forget this one thing, at least do this one thing. And Dave, I'll start with you and then do Scott and Phil to round it out.
Yeah, I guess, think about the things that might fall outside your standard process, 0 days and the like, and understanding that there may be times that you need to deal with elevated risks, and that you need to think about ahead of time how those are going to fall into your standard processes with your 35 calendar days and all your assessments and that sort of thing. So just think about the edge cases as well as the main kind of standards.
And I would say, there's an aspect of this that is compliance box checking that said I did the thing in the right time frame. When I think about it from a risk perspective, and I think one of the biggest things you can do is inventory and segmentation. Look at how these assets are protected from everything else. You may allow VPNs into your environment, but in essence, you're taking that outside asset and bringing it in. I would look at stronger ways of segregating your critical assets from the rest of the thing of your environments.
Yeah, and I would say reduce the chaff. There's a lot of, the vast majority of vulnerabilities and patchwork out there is not valuable to the system you're protecting, and find a way to identify the things that really matter, so that it's incredible. There's an incredible amount of work to mitigate, to patch, and to make that meaningful.
Awesome. Well, thank you all. That's all the time we have for now. Thank everyone on the webinar for giving us part of your day. I'd like to thank our panelists for their candid perspectives on this challenging requirement. And I hope everyone appreciates the context and you've gotten some solutions to consider. I'm a big fan of Bastazo and what they're doing, and I'm sure we'll be doing some more webinars together with them like this in the future. Please feel free to reach out to the panelists directly or even continue the conversation on LinkedIn. And that's all we have for today. Thanks, everyone.
Good seeing y'all.
Yeah, likewise.
Take it easy.